In this session, we will discuss about KubeADM. Before we discuss about KubeADM, you need to know that we are going to set up the Kubernetes cluster now. We have discussed about master and worker node, what are the components and other things. Now we will be setting up the Kubernetes cluster. So for setting up the Kubernetes cluster, we are going to use a tool. The tool name is KubeADM. So what is KubeADM? KubeADM is the tool to set up the Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so it's a tool which will be setting up the minimal viable Kubernetes cluster of production grade. Using KubeADM, we will be applying some of the best practices how to set up the Kubernetes cluster. So this tool will be setting up all the master component as in the form of container. Okay, we will see that thing as well. So using why to use KubeADM tool? First of all, it's easy to set up. Okay. Second is it's going to provide the production grade solution to you. Kubernetes KubeADM creates a full PKI setup. PKI stands for public key infrastructure setup. So even the Kubernetes component like API server, when it communicates to the etcd, is a full encrypted communication is there. There would be a internal certificate authority will be created, and each component will be having a private key and CRT for the communication purpose. KubeADM is a tool built to provide KubeADM init and join command as the best practices fast path for creating the Kubernetes cluster. We will be using two commands, KubeADM init and KubeADM join. What init does it? Whichever Linux machine you are going to run the command kubedm init, it will set up the master component on that particular Linux machine. So kubedm init bootstraps a Kubernetes control plane node by executing the following things. What are the following things it will do? It will do the pre-flight check. Pre-flight check in the sense it will go and see the your virtual machine resources, whether the resources are available properly or not, whether SAP memory is switch off or not, whether the kubelet service is running or not. So all these things as a part of system validation part before the components are going to deploy it, they will be checking it up. So pre-flight check to validate the system start state before making the changes. Then it will be generating the CA, okay, cell sign CA to set up the identities for each component in the cluster. The user can provide their own CA cert as well. But in this case, we are going to use the default CA. And then it will write the kube config file. Kube config file, like all the master components, they will be setting up the configuration file, how the component should be created. All these things will be available there under etc Kubernetes. For the kubelet, the controller manager add the scheduler to use to connect to the API server, each of with its own identity, as well as additional kubeconfig file for the administrator account, that is name admin.conf. So we will discuss this particular section in detail once the setup is done. Okay, it will be using a static pod concept. Static pod concept also we will discuss when I will explain you the pod, what is pod, how in Kubernetes, and then we will discuss this particular chapter, static pod manifest. Okay, how this kubedm is setting up your cluster. So static pod is the concept where all the configuration file will be there on the static location, and kubelet will be creating the pod. Basically pod is nothing but container in Kubernetes world. Okay, static pod manifest are written. Manifest means configuration file is written under this location, etc Kubernetes manifest, and kubelet watches is directive for pods to create as a startup. Apply labels and taint. We will discuss taint and tolerations. What is taint? How the affinity is working it out, and all these things. Generate the token so the other worker node can join the cluster. So that token will be generated on the fly. Okay. So KubeADM init will be setting up all the master component as well as bootstrap token. It will be generating it up. Writing a config file for making available all the information required for joining and setting up the RBAC rule. Install the core DNS and kubeproxy component as well via the API server. Okay. So basic idea is KubeADM is a tool which you need to install on your all the cluster virtual machines like master and worker node. In the master component, you will be running the QVDM init command. Init command will do the pre-flight check. Then it will be setting up the PKI, public key infrastructure, CSRTs. Then it will be creating the config file and installing the master component in the form of static pod using kubelet. Then comes to the QVDM join command. QVDM join command is used to add the new worker node to the existing cluster, or whenever we create a cluster on the worker node, I will be running the QVDM join command. When initially you set up the Kubernetes cluster, QVDM init command, you run it, it will generate a unique token. This token is required for the worker node to join the cluster. So you will be running QVDM join hyphen hyphen token, control plane IP, port number, and discovery token CSRT hash. After executing the join command, the worker node will be establishing the connection with the control plane. It will download the necessary component and dependency to become the part of the Kubernetes cluster. So we are going to use this tool, and on master or one of the Linux machine, you will run the QVDM init command. Whichever Linux machine you run the init command will set up the master on that particular machine only. The rest of the virtual machine, you need to run the join command, and the join command will join the cluster. Okay, so join command you need to run on the worker node. So this is the some session about QVDM. Now, before we proceed for the further topics, I will explain you the kubectl in the next session, and then we will progress with the setup. Thank you for joining the session.